In 64 CE, a naked woman stumbles through the cobblestone streets of Rome, her body covered in human waste and fresh wounds. The crowd of thousands roars with bloodlust as she's dragged by chains toward the Colosseum. But that's not even the worst part. What you're about to discover will shatter everything you thought you knew about Roman civilization. By the end of this video, you'll understand why modern historians tried to bury this story for centuries and why some still refuse to teach it. I'm going to reveal 3 things that will haunt you. First, how Rome turned execution into the ultimate sexual entertainment. Second, the one specific crime that guaranteed this horrifying fate. And third, why emperors personally attended these nightmares and sometimes even participated. But here's what nobody tells you about ancient Rome's most depraved spectacle. If you think you can handle the brutal truth about humanity's darkest impulses, hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens next will change how you see ancient Rome and maybe even our own society forever. You think you know about Roman brutality, gladiators fighting to the death? That was just the opening act. The real horror show was reserved for women who dared to defy the empire. Picture this. It's the height of the Roman Empire, between the 1st and 3rd century CE. Rome controls half the known world, built magnificent architecture, created legal systems we still use today. This was supposed to be the pinnacle of civilization. But beneath the marble statues and grand speeches about honor, Rome had perfected something far more sinister than simple execution. They had weaponized sexual humiliation as the ultimate form of state terror. You see, for Romans, death wasn't enough. The empire needed to send a message that would echo through the streets, into every household, into the nightmares of anyone who might dare to challenge their power. Public executions weren't just about punishment, they were theater, carefully choreographed spectacles designed to break not just the body, but the spirit, the dignity, the very humanity of the condemned. Here's what historians don't want you to know. Rome didn't just execute women, they systematically destroyed them in the most intimate, degrading ways possible, turning their deaths into pornographic entertainment for the masses. But this wasn't random violence. This was calculated psychological warfare perfected over centuries, refined by emperors who understood that the threat of sexual humiliation could control an entire population. And the most terrifying part? The crowds loved it. Men, women, children, entire families would pack the arenas to watch women be stripped, violated, and slowly tortured to death. But that's nothing compared to what I'm about to show you, because the parade through the streets, that was just the warm-up act. Don't click away yet, because what happened in the arena makes everything else you've just heard seem merciful. Imagine you're standing in the streets of ancient Rome. The air reeks of unwashed bodies, rotting food, and something else. Fear, mixed with excitement. The crowd is getting restless because they know what's coming. Then you hear it, the rhythmic clank of chains echoing off stone walls. The crowd surges forward as guards drag a naked woman through the forum. Her crime? It could be anything from adultery to treason to simply refusing a powerful man's advances. This is damnatio, ad bestiuris, condemnation to the beasts. But here's what makes your stomach turn. Before facing the animals, she endures something worse. The Roman poet Martial wrote eyewitness accounts that historians kept buried for centuries. He describes how the crowd would throw human waste, rotting vegetables, and sharp stones at these naked women. But that wasn't the worst part. The guards would force the condemned to stop at specific points throughout the city. Not randomly, but at carefully chosen locations. Outside temples where she might have worshipped, past the homes of her family members, through markets where she once shopped. Why? Because Romans understood that destroying someone's dignity was more powerful than simply ending their life. They were erasing not just the person, but their entire existence in the community. Martial writes about one woman who tried to cover herself with her hands. The guards broke her fingers. Another attempted to fall to avoid the crowd's gaze. They dragged her upright and forced her to walk. But here's the detail that will chill you to the bone. families were encouraged to attend. Roman parents brought their children to witness these parades. They called it education, teaching the consequences of defying Roman law. The woman's own relatives would sometimes join the crowd, throwing stones at their daughter, sister, or mother, because if they didn't participate in the humiliation, they risked the same fate. And the guards? They weren't just following orders. They were specifically trained in psychological torture. They knew exactly how long to pause at each location to maximize the trauma. They understood which parts of the body to expose for maximum degradation. But that parade through the streets, that was just the beginning. What awaited these women in the arena would make everything you've just heard seem merciful. Don't scroll away, because what I'm about to reveal next will shock you even more than what you've already seen. The arena gates slammed shut behind her. 50,000 Romans packed the stands, cheering like they're watching a sporting event. But this isn't about lions or gladiators. This is about turning a human being's final moments into pornographic theater. Here's what historians tried to hide. Roman executions weren't quick deaths. Women were forced to reenact mythological rape scenes before being killed. They would dress them as mythological figures, Europa being ravaged by Zeus as bull, Leda assaulted by the swan. But these weren't symbolic reenactments. Roman guards would use trained animals to actually assault these women while the crowd watched and cheered. The historian Cassius Dio documented the trial of Empress Messalina in shocking detail. When she was condemned for adultery, really for threatening the emperor's power, they forced her to endure every degradation they had perfected over centuries. First, they stripped her before a crowd of senators. Then they made her crawl through the arena on her hands and knees, while spectators threw objects at her naked body.
Just the prelude. Here's the part that makes your blood run cold. They had a specific term for this torture: supplica. It wasn't just execution. It was the systematic destruction of a person's humanity before killing them. They would bring in animals trained specifically for sexual violence. Bears, bulls, horses, all conditioned to assault human beings while crowds of families watched and ate snacks. But here's what nobody tells you about the crowd's reaction. They weren't just passive observers. The audience would vote on which torments to inflict next. Thumbs up for more humiliation. Thumbs down for a quick death, which rarely came. Roman mothers would point out specific techniques to their daughters, explaining how to avoid the same fate. Roman fathers would describe the women's screams to their sons as lessons in power and control. The emperor's box provided the best view for a reason. This wasn't just entertainment. It was a masterclass in imperial power broadcast live to demonstrate what happened to anyone who challenged the system. And the most haunting detail of all? Some of these women were still alive when the animals were finished with them. The crowd would demand they be kept conscious for the final act, being slowly dismembered while aware. Yet, there was one type of woman who faced an even worse fate than what you've just witnessed. Don't scroll yet. The Vestal Virgin story will make everything else seem merciful. Now imagine the most sacred women in all of Rome, the Vestal Virgins. These priestesses maintained the eternal flame that supposedly kept the empire alive. They were untouchable, revered, more powerful than senators, until they weren't. When a Vestal Virgin was accused of breaking her vow of chastity, Rome faced a problem. Killing a sacred priestess could anger the gods, but letting defiance go unpunished could destroy imperial authority. So they created something worse than public execution. Something so terrifying that it haunted Roman nightmares for generations. Here's what they did. First, they stripped the Vestal Virgin naked in front of the entire Roman Senate. Not quickly, slowly, ceremonially, while senators debated her fate. She stood there, exposed and shivering for hours. But that was just the beginning. The historian Pliny the Younger documented what happened to the Vestals under Emperor Domitian in letters that were hidden for centuries. He describes how they would beat these sacred women with rods until their skin split open, all while keeping them conscious. Then came the most horrifying part. They would bury them alive, but not just any burial. They would lower the Vestal into an underground chamber with just enough air to keep her conscious for days. They would leave her a small lamp, some bread and water. Not enough to live, just enough to prolong the agony. The chamber walls were lined with broken pottery, so if she tried to scratch her way out, she would shred her fingers to bone. They designed every detail to maximize psychological torture. Here's the detail that will haunt you. They could hear her screams from above ground for days, sometimes weeks, and Romans would bring their families to listen, calling it a religious ceremony. Pliny writes about one Vestal who survived for 18 days underground. 18 days of complete darkness, slowly starving, listening to her own voice echo off stone walls. But the most twisted part? If she somehow survived the ordeal, they would declare it divine intervention and then execute her anyway, for corrupting the sacred ritual with her continued existence. The Emperor Domitian personally designed these chambers. He would visit construction sites to ensure the acoustics carried the screams properly. He called it architectural theology, using sound to demonstrate divine justice. But the most shocking part? Emperors made this personal. And what I'm about to reveal next will show you just how far Roman depravity could go when power became absolute. Here's the truth historians don't want you to know. Emperors didn't just watch these rituals. They designed them. They participated in them. They turned sexual humiliation into their personal entertainment system. Emperor Caligula didn't just attend executions. He choreographed them like theatrical productions. He would spend weeks planning every detail of a woman's degradation, consulting with architects, animal trainers, and torture specialists to create new forms of suffering. But here's what makes your blood freeze. He would invite foreign dignitaries to watch, ambassadors from Egypt, Germania, Britannia, all forced to witness Rome's capacity for creative brutality. It was diplomatic terrorism broadcast live. Caligula once ordered the construction of a special arena beneath his palace where he could experiment with torture techniques in private. Archaeological evidence suggests he tested methods on slave women before implementing them in public executions. Emperor Nero took it even further. He would dress as a gladiator and personally participate in the sexual assault of condemned women. The crowd would cheer as their emperor raped prisoners to death, calling it divine justice. But here's the most terrifying revelation. This wasn't madness. This was policy. Sexual humiliation became Rome's standard diplomatic tool. When foreign queens defied Roman rule, they didn't just execute them, they broadcast their degradation across the empire as a warning to other rulers. The historical consequences were staggering. Entire cultures changed their laws about women's rights simply to avoid provoking Roman sexual torture. Treaties would include specific clauses about preservation of dignity in surrender terms. Roman sexual violence became so systematic that they created government positions specifically for designing new torments. The magistrate of public degradation was a real job title with salary and benefits. But then, something unexpected happened. Christianity began spreading through the empire, and suddenly, Roman citizens started questioning whether their entertainment was actually moral. It wasn't immediate. The practices continued for decades after Christian conversion began. But slowly, Roman crowds started staying away from executions. Emperors found themselves performing to empty arenas. By the 4th century, the spectacles ended, not because of imperial decree, but because Romans finally lost their appetite for watching women be destroyed for entertainment. But here's what should terrify you. It took 3 centuries of Christian influence to stop practices that had become so normalized that families considered them educational entertainment. The psychological infrastructure of sexual humiliation was so deeply embedded in Roman culture that it survived longer than gladiatorial combat, longer than animal hunts, longer than almost any other aspect of arena entertainment. And the final haunting detail? When archaeologists excavated private Roman homes, they found domestic artwork depicting these execution scenes. Romans decorated their dining rooms with images of women being sexually tortured to death. They had made brutality so normal that it became home decor. So what does this tell us about human nature? About civilization? About the thin line between order and savagery? Rome's legacy of institutionalized sexual violence reveals something terrifying. Any society can normalize the unthinkable if it serves those in power. What we've just explored wasn't the product of individual madness. It was systematic, bureaucratic, socially acceptable torture. And here's what should keep you awake at night. Public shaming still functions in our society today. We just use different tools. Social media mobs, viral humiliation, coordinated harassment campaigns. The technology changes, but the psychological impulse remains. The Romans convinced themselves they were civilized while cheering for sexual torture. What are we convincing ourselves of today? Think about it. What entertainment are we consuming that future historians might judge as barbaric? What forms of public humiliation have we normalized without even realizing it? I want to know what you think. What other civilized societies throughout history use sexual humiliation as a tool of control? And more importantly, where do you see echoes of Roman brutality in our modern world? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Hit that subscribe button for more hidden historical truths. And I'll see you next week when we explore another dark secret that historians tried to bury.